Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at triathletics.com. I wanted to address this question of why pitchers should train overhead, or should pitchers be training overhead. And some coaches, especially strength coaches, kind of see pitchers as these fragile beings where we can't do anything overhead because we might injure them. We're just going to do floor press, we're just going to do push-ups, and we're going to totally avoid doing a ton of overhead movements. My take on this is a little bit different. I'm not saying that we need to be wonder at maxing on overhead, barbell press, shoulder press, things like that. That's certainly not the case. But pitching does take place overhead. If you even go to where the acceleration is happening, it's around 90 to 100 degrees of shoulder abduction in some cases. And as you get into the follow through, you really start to get into these overhead positions where you're essentially throwing your arm off your body. You need to be able to have adequate length in these positions, but you also need, more importantly, to have adequate stability as your arm travels exceptionally fast through the acceleration phase and into bar release and into the follow through. So the way that I kind of see training overhead is, let's train ourselves, let's bulletproof these end range positions, let's bulletproof these overhead positions rather than totally avoiding them. So are there intelligent, progressive ways to bulletproof these positions versus just kind of being an idiot, and why overhead lifting gets a bad rap for some players with some of these other movements. So in this video, we're going to go over some different ways to begin training overhead if you aren't already, some of my favorite movements for each of these categories, and just kind of giving the rationale for that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the video. So the first category I've labeled is overhead holds. Now the idea here is that we're getting in that overhead position, right? We're trying to figure out a way to be stable in this overhead position, and we're going to apply an approximation or compressive force. So a force going straight down through that shoulder joint. Again, we're kind of mimicking that position that you're going to be in follow through when you do get fully overhead. So when it comes to the overhead holds, what we're doing here is we're getting into a position of upward rotation, and we're training the upward rotators to be able to stabilize against that compressive force. So we're really working on the serratus anterior here. We're also working on the scapular stabilizing muscles, the lower trap, the middle trap, to be able to fire and support that position as well. So a very basic exercise here might be a yoga push-up or a push-up to a downward dog, where you're not really loading that position too much, but you're just grooving that scapular movement into upward rotation with a little bit of a hold at the top. That can be made a little bit more difficult with something like a yoga push-up to one arm, where now you're adding a little bit more load. Again, still not super high time under tension, but another basic progression from there. Kettlebell waiter walks are one of my favorites to train overhead stability. Again, we can train the 90 degree or 90 to 100 degree shoulder abduction position that we're in for a lot of the pitching delivery. And we can also train the full overhead shoulder flexion position with kettlebell waiter walks at 180 degrees. So both of those are great variations as well to train this overhead hold position. And then finally, one that doesn't get talked about a lot, but that I have been programming more, utilizing myself, is handstand progressions. So this is kind of similar to the yoga push-up position in that it's a bodyweight exercise where we're just getting overhead, but now we're actually adding a little bit more load and a little bit more targeted time under tension to this overhead position. Now, I don't want you to just go ahead and start trying to do handstands, on your own. There's a progression to this. So the way that we'll kind of implement this, progress it, is with a wall variation, where you can really start with just a small percentage of your body weight. You just kind of walk your feet up on the wall, and you can utilize just enough of your body weight to get comfortable in that position. As you get more comfortable there, you can walk your hands closer to the wall, and eventually get into this overhead position. This isn't one that you necessarily need to do without a wall for the sake of that stability. A lot of athletes are going to have trouble ever doing this without using the wall as support. But again, it's still a great exercise to do even with the wall handstand variation. Again, you're really working on the serratus, really working on that scapular stability component. So that's an underappreciated way to train the overhead position for pitchers. The next category and way to train overhead was what I call overhead hangs. Now again, we're taking that overhead position, and as opposed to having an approximation or compressive force, we're now having a distraction force. So now that force it's a traction force, it's pulling that shoulder out of the socket. Now this is really important because in pitching, at release, there's approximately a 100% of body weight force a distraction force that's essentially ripping your arm out of the socket. So every time you throw, you're trying to throw your arm out of your body, and there's this huge force trying to pull that arm out of the socket, and this creates a ton of eccentric stress through the rotator cuff, through the posterior cuff. So all the muscles on the backside of your shoulder are fighting and contracting to not let that arm fly off your body. And so a lot of athletes really aren't training to be able to bulletproof this position and bulletproof this stress, and we train the rotator cuff, you know, with external rotation type movements, with stability type movements, but rarely do we actually expose the arm to these types of loads in training. And so a way to progress to this is you can start with something as simple as a lat hang, where your lower half is on the ground, but you're hanging from a bar. And we use this as a corrective exercise, but we also use it as a way to gain some lat length and as a way to begin to expose the arm to some of that distraction force. Again, that's really only about 30–40% of your body weight per arm. From there, you can progress to regular bar hangs, all of your body weight. Again, this is a great grip strengthening exercise. Another way to groove lat length or build length through the lats as you drive the rib cage down with each exhale. So you actually lengthen the lats, get a better overhead position. And again, expose yourself to about 50% of your body weight per arm. And then from there, eventually you can work up to single arm hangs. Now, single arm hangs are really the gold standard here for being able to train that stress, that distraction force, because now you're using 100% of your body weight. It's an amazing grip strengthening exercise. It's an amazing exercise to groove that lat length. And then again, we're exposing ourselves to an incredible amount of stress that you're not normally going to get when it comes to training rotator cuff any other way. So again, ton of benefit there. That's the second way to train overhead. So the next category here, I just labeled IYTL, and this really refers to any scapular retraction, scapular strengthening exercise where your overhead, you're at least 90 degrees or above as far as shoulder flexion, and you're resisting an anterior force. So anything where you're doing an I, a Y pattern, a T pattern, an L pattern. So again, this can be TRX, IYTLs, this can be prone IYTLs, single arm off a table with a 5-pound dumbbell. This can be standing with a J-band, with a crossover symmetry, with a cable machine. A ton of different ways to train, but again, we've taken that overhead position, we've trained an approximation force, we've trained a distraction force, now we're training that posterior force application. And again, you can see we're just trying to get really, really stable in all directions and activate the musculature surrounding that shoulder joint in all directions in that overhead position. So the next category would be incline pressing. Now this could be something as simple as an incline dumbbell bench press. However, you don't necessarily have the same scapular movement and you don't get into full overhead shoulder flexion on a dumbbell bench press like we're ultimately trying to go for. So a better alternative, if you're trying to go for training overhead, getting that scapular movement component, is some sort of landmine press. That's one of my favorite options here. Now, if you do have a handstand variation or some sort of overhead hold in your program, you still can do incline bench press, you still can do a flat dumbbell bench press, push-ups, all these other things, because you're able to train that range. But again, landmine press is another good option for being able to get overhead, groove that full shoulder flexion, and do so in kind of a more dynamic way versus a static hold. The next category would be incline or vertical pulling variations. Now this one is maybe a little bit more controversial because one of the muscles that can stop us from getting overhead safely is the lats. If our lats are super toned up, gritty, dense, and we don't have that full overhead shoulder flexion, then these are the last athletes who need to be immediately going and cranking out a bunch of half rep chin-ups or heavy pull-ups. So again, I'm not saying that if you're not quite ready for these exercises that you should be doing these, but again, once we've grooved an athlete to be able to get the adequate range, we want to gain stability in that range of motion. So vertical pulling, one of my favorites here, is a wide grip dead hang pull-up. Why I like this so much is that we're not cutting the range of motion off. We're actually getting a nice big stretch at the bottom of that movement. We're allowing the shoulders to elevate, to protract a little bit, and we're driving the rib cage down, getting that big stretch through the lat before we then ask it to contract through that full range of motion. So when it comes to the lats, we don't just want length, we actually want strength through length. So we don't just want to totally turn off, inhibit the lats. The lats are one of the most important accelerators in the pitching motion. So once we restore that length, we need to be able to train strength through that full range of motion. And I like the wide grip pull-ups specifically for that, because when it comes to a more supinated chin-up grip, you're not going to be able to get into that full overhead position With wide grip, it gives you a little bit more of a forgiving position, a little bit wider than shoulder width, and you can still get fully overhead. Now, some other ways to groove overhead shoulder flexion are a cable compound row. Now, this is a movement that was first introduced to me by one of my mentors, Nick Tuminello. Great movement to train that as well. You can really get a good stretch, drive the rib cage down, and feel that lat stretch before you ask it to then contract. And then pullover variations are another good way to do this. I have mixed feelings when it comes to dumbbell pullovers depending on the guy. One thing that we found is very helpful for feeling this is actually standing cable pullovers or standing straight arm pull downs. So an easier way to feel that full overhead shoulder flexion, a little bit more of a forgiving position on the shoulders while still grooving that range of motion. Now, the final category here is what I'm calling rhythmic stabilizations. You could also call it co-contraction. You can think about it, again, we have this overhead position. We've trained approximation, distraction. We've trained posterior force application. We've now trained incline pressing. We've now trained incline pulling. So we've trained it to be able to stabilize and contract dynamically in every direction. The rhythmic stabilization piece is teaching all those muscles to fire in unison. So to really be able to not just push in one direction, but stabilize. That would be what the co-contraction piece is. So for this, we can use partner variations where a partner is actually trying to perturbate or move your arm around in various specific positions. If you don't have a partner, then other good exercises would be a shoulder tube, a body blade, or one of my favorites is actually the shoulder sphere. So again, you can really teach all these muscles to not just be strong, but be able to fire with good timing and in unison to stabilize the shoulder in the joint. So this is the concept of centration, which is really, really important here to understand, is that you need to be able to keep that golf ball on the tee. You need to be able to keep the shoulder centered in the socket as you move around overhead. That's when a lot of issues begin to happen, is when you don't have that shoulder stability, that scapular stability component. Now the shoulder's basically wobbling around inside that joint as you expose it to these super, super high stresses. So that's the main reason that the rhythmic stabilization component is so important as well. It's not just about building strength, it's about building the timing of that co-contraction. So that's all I have for you guys today. One disclaimer, however, don't go ahead and just dive into doing all these exercises and trying to write your own program. This is just a very small preview of some of the exercises that we will program with our athletes. Again, they are still doing other correctives, other movement approaches to try to improve their range of motion overhead. We're not just throwing advanced handstand progressions at them day one. So just take that for what it is. This is just giving you guys some more training ideas to begin to incorporate. But again, make sure that you get a full movement screen, a full evaluation, whatever you're doing, so that you understand what your limitations are and you understand where you fit on the regressions or the progressions of some of these exercises. You might really only be ready to do a yoga push-up. You might not be ready to do some sort of advanced handstand progression. I'm just showing you some examples of what we do with our athletes. If you guys enjoyed this content, go ahead, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you aren't already. If you're an athlete, you're struggling in your own career, maybe you're a coach and you're trying to figure out this thing called pitching development, go ahead, shoot us an email to contact@triathletics.com with your questions. We read and respond to every single email. We look forward to helping you, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks again.